From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. I know it has been a very difficult year for many of you, and for listeners in California, Oregon, and Washington, it was particularly difficult because of the wildfires that swept through the region in late summer. And I've had a lot of questions as an extension agent here in Oregon about what about the bees that were in the path of those fires. And that made me think it was time to reach out to Jim Kane, who is no stranger to the show. He's been on multiple times. He's a retired scientist from the USDA Bee Lab in Logan, Utah. And he studied the biology of bees and fire extensively in work, as you're going to hear in this episode, in sagebrush steppe systems on the east side of the Cascades in the Great Basin. But in this episode, he's going to give us a lay of the land of what we might expect happen to some of our bee communities in the path of the fire, but also what to expect in the coming years as successional plant communities start to step in and we start to see changes in those landscapes. Dr. Kane also has some suggestions after the break on restoration decisions for dealing with burned landscapes. So without further ado, I'm pleased to bring back Dr. Jim Kane this week on Pollination. Welcome back to Pollination, Jim.
Thank you, Anthony. It's a delight to talk with you, as always.
We had some correspondence during the summer. As you remember, this was a terrible, terrible fire year in California and Oregon and into Washington. And at the time, I was getting a lot of questions through Ask an Expert and other extension portals where people were concerned about bees and fires. And when I went through the literature and looked for examples of people who had worked on the actual biology of bees and fires, you were the person at the top of the list. Tell me how you got interested in this question of fire disturbance and bee communities.
Well, it stemmed from actually an interest on the part of the Bureau of Land Management, and the largest research project that they supported, especially through Peggy Olwell a couple of decades ago, was to try to do a better job of rehabilitating fire site burned areas in the sagebrush steppe between the eastern Cascades and over here in Utah, where, as you recollect, there were some fire years with dry lightning storms that lit off hundreds of thousands of acres. And their reseeding efforts and the like weren't being that successful, and they were very simplistic. They were mostly sagebrush and a few grass species, some of them exotic grasses, and they wanted to put back more of a plant community. So while I was assisting with pollination of various promising wildflower species that are widespread out there and used extensively by bees, which I documented, I became quite worried that, wow, when fire goes through sagebrush steppe, it looks like a lunar landscape afterwards. Not a shrub, not a stick, nothing. It's just bare, dusty dirt and a little bit of ash. And so I became deeply concerned that, wow, if bees are surviving, are bees being consumed by this? And if not, if they're surviving, what in the world are they going to use the next generation? So since many of these bees have one spring or early summer generation that live in the sagebrush steppe. So I did heating experiments thinking that, well, maybe there's some susceptible life stages. It turns out it's not. Eggs, larvae, pupae, and adults all have the usual temperature sensitivity of around 40 degrees C, about the temperature in which proteins to nature. But eggs are not more susceptible, for instance. In addition, my graduate student and technician, Byron Love, did some very nice experimental work with access to a suite of dominant perennial wildflowers that are herbaceous out there that bees use extensively, and found that while several of them are quite susceptible to fire because their apical buds are above the ground level, most of them survive just fine with an August or September burn, which is when most of the fires pass through. And so we came to realize that, this isn't such a bad thing. If the native flora was in good shape before the fire, because these fires in sagebrush steppe, the fuels aren't as great as your forest fires, and their residence time over the soil is quite limited, doesn't heat the soil much, most of the pollinators are ground nesters, and everything comes back the following year, except that the forbs now don't have all the water competition with sagebrush.
Huh.
So that's where my experience comes from. I've been learning a little bit more with fires in your West Coast forest, working with Sarah Galbraith and Jim Rivers on a large project down in the Douglas Fire Complex. But I think there's things that we can predict in advance of what will have happened to bee fawns in these fires, and some are going to be quite different because the fuel loads, the residence time, the intensity of the fire is quite different in mature forests.
Well, let's come back to just what happens, because there is I like the way that you laid the problem out, because there are connected and related issues. And the first one is just surviving the fire, that there's a bee community that's humming around doing all its work and living its life, and then a fire comes through. And I guess primarily, if we were to consider two kind of life history patterns, one is stem nesting and one is ground nesting. I would imagine if you're a stem nester, you probably won't survive. But what do we know about the ground nesting bees and their capacity to? You talked about the stages are equally vulnerable, but imagine there's some buffering capacity of being a few inches into the ground.
That's exactly right. For the twig nesters, I think they're toast. I don't see any way around that. They're lucky if there's an island of unburned vegetation in the midst of a fire perimeter. But otherwise, they're toast. So they're small carpenter bees, genus Ceratina, that some of your listeners will know, would be one familiar example. For ground nesters, Jack Neff and I did a large survey of nesting depths or nest cell depths of ground nesting bees, or everything we could find in the literature, with Jack being the more encyclopedic of the two of us, and came up with 400 and some odd reports of cell depth. And it averages out around 12 or 15 inches underground for the average bee. With the range, the deepest bees, which are incredible, are 3 or 4 meters down. A solitary bee digging that phone. And the shallowest ones happen to be bees of the genus, some of the megachilids, to which the blue orchard bee and the alfalfa leafcutter bee belong. Most people don't appreciate it, but a number of those are nests in the ground, most quite shallowly. We've dug an unnamed species of osmia over here in eastern Nevada, and its little nest cells are tucked into grass tussocks. I've worked with another one in Wyoming who made its nest in dried up cow dung. Those among the ground nesters, those will be the most susceptible, I presume. And I think they fare okay with sagebrush steppe because the genus Osmia is one of the 3 dominant bee genera that we see at wildflower species after wildflower species out here. Huge number, huge diversity of them.
Oh, so even if they nest shallowly, if you go back the next year, you see them show up again. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Byron and I initially established, and Byron came on, Byron Love, to make this his PhD project, part of it, and did what we call a chrono sequence. Since we couldn't light off fires, and we couldn't wait for 20 years for fires to age, we took a series of big fires of different ages, and sampled them over a handful of years for their bee faunas, both at least a half mile inside the fire perimeter. So these are all big fires, to make sure that they are resident bees, not commuters from outside the edge, and then matching them to outside the fire. We don't know what the flora was like inside the fire because we weren't there to observe it. And what we found is even in the year after burning, a number of these osmia are still present and working their particular wildflowers. We walked one last year, the Valley Fire, a very remote fire in Nevada. And there were all the bees. present and accounted for. So from that perspective, revegetation efforts in which one, especially if one's using camera range drills to put in seed and tearing up the surface, are actually going to be detrimental to both those shallow nesting bees and to the surviving wildflowers whose apical meristems are near the surface, like biscuit root, for instance. So one has to know their vegetation a little bit in order to accommodate where the effort is needed.
Jim,
where it changes,
can I just pick up on that one point, because I think I kind of followed you, but so the current practice after a fire, or a practice after the fire, is to get the seed in and to revegetate, is to go in and disturb the soil, which may have an effect on some of these shallow nesting bees, as opposed to if it was just left on its own, it probably would revegetate anyways. Is that what you were getting at?
Yeah, and mind you, there are for sure cheatgrass, the flammable Eurasian grass that is a potent invasive in the sagebrush steppe. It's hiding out in places in and amongst the sagebrush, and so when that surface is cleared, it's an annual grass and it can germinate quickly. And there are times in which there's a transition to cheatgrass, and those are the things that the land managers would be best to focus on. The reason they reseed so quickly is it happens to be the legal policy under which Bureau of Land Management in particular operates. I suppose the original intent was to make sure that there wasn't dawdling involved, but by law they have to seed before the snow flies, and or at least buy that seed before the snow flies and use it. And if they were only a tweak of that, granted them an extra year to wait and see what's coming up first, then they could spend more money on smaller areas where there really is a problem that they can address. So it's a policy issue. It's something humans created, and it's something humans can fix.
Okay, that good to know. I do want to move back into fire severity, because you mentioned that in the sagebrush system, even a shallow nesting bee, it seems as though it's just not getting hot enough to hit those critical temperatures, depending on what stage it's going through the winter or the late summer. But in the forest fires that we've experienced here in west of the Cascades, are we seeing similar temperatures, and do you anticipate that same shallow nesting bee just being able to ride out a large fire?
Well, most of this I've learned from reading a very good book by Leonard Dabano, who's a lifetime fire ecologist out of University of Arizona, Sandra Dabano's father, as it turns out.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I saw the name, but I just thought it was a coincidence. I'll be darned. Our vertebrate ecologist at Hermiston. That's wonderful.
Yeah. And he pointed out, he gathered together the literature, which is quite scattered because historically it's been very hard to instrument for fires because all the wiring and stuff would melt. So people who wanted to monitor what happens with temperature with a fire had to bury everything. Bury the lead wires, bury the data loggers, bury the sensors. It was a huge, and so try to replicate that across the fire, and then have a wildfire like what you folks have been having with that intensity versus a control burn. Very difficult. So what he pointed out in particular is that most of the heat, as heat does, goes up with a fire if it can. However, if you have under a log or underneath a thick duff, anything that ashes over or insulates the top of the burn, especially a smoldering burn, heat will be driven down because it's insulated on top.
I see.
And that's when you start getting soil penetration. So under a log deck, that has been studied, and you can get some pretty lethal heat down 6 inches or a foot or more underneath a log deck that endures for days. So it's a different story in forests, and it's going to depend on which bee species or genus you're talking about. and how deep they nest, in addition to whether or not they were flying at the time of the fire, or whether they were all done with their nesting year and calmly underground, just being survived by their progeny. So different story.
And I guess the other thing is I imagine the density when you're deep down in the forest, the number of bee nests is not going to be very as dense as in an open meadow area. So that I imagine
that's actually a very good point.
Yeah,
that's a very good point. If it's thick, deep stuff, bees aren't going to be nesting in it anyway. And so that is probably not an issue for the most part. Now, bumblebees, I don't think we've found enough nests. But some bumblebees, maybe a lot of them, adopt abandoned burrows of organisms like chipmunks. They may be underground, but then chipmunk burrows, their little, I guess, dens, their nests are actually quite deep. So they might be okay. The only problem for them, or other social bees, is they emerge 2 days after the fire if they didn't get caught out. And where are the flowers? All of a sudden, their whole realm is then transformed to a burnt landscape. But yes, for the ones that will be susceptible are the ones that are active, either because they're social or because they fly at the time of year when those fires happen. So a late summer species of solitary bee, for instance.
Okay, that's great. That gives us an idea of how the bee community is going to be shaped, at least the residents who come out either the next year, well, who invariably the year after the fire will be popping out. And I guess that flips to the second dimension that you raised of the plant community the next year. And imagine in sagebrush and forest, we're looking at probably different capacities to rebound from a fire and provide those bees with resources. Can you tell us a little bit about what we know about different plant communities? The sagebrush system you've described, but maybe more what we might expect here west of the Cascades.
Yeah, west of the Cascades, one thing that is striking with the sagebrush steppe versus the warm deserts of the south is most of the shrubs in the sagebrush steppe are wind pollinated. So sagebrush is a prime example. Horsebush is another. There's a number of them. And so there are some that bees work, but a lot of them are wind pollinated. And so it's no loss to those bees in terms of forage if those plants are gone. In the southern deserts, the warm deserts, or over where you are, there's a lot more shrubs. My impression is a lot more shrubs that bees use for pollen and nectar. And fire's going to take those shrubs just like it takes the trees. Some of them are adapted for stumps for sprouting from below, but it's not going to be for the next year that I doubt they're going to have flowers. But so blueberries, ceanothus, manzanita, there's a whole bunch of them that huckleberries that bees use extensively that could be really set back for a while by fire. Now, a number of those also rebound, especially with ground fires. Things like blueberries seem to respond positively, and huckleberries. But they may not flower the year right after the fire. But the bees, the resident local bees, can't really wait for multiple years. We really don't know how that plays out. As awful as these fires were for people and for property and everything else, and for the forest there in Western Oregon and California, this would be an opportunity to actually go out onto the bigger burns, out to the middle of them, and see who's flying this coming flight season.
That's a really good point, and I guess it picks up one dimension because it is possible that the year after the fire, those bees have very poor reproductive success, and there's a real lull. But that as you pointed out, in subsequent years, some of these early successional shrubs will move in and start to establish, and that there may be more productivity there than there was, the decade previous. It could.
Yeah.
But
you remove that overstory of shade in a conifer forest, especially.
I remember Andy Muldanky had a funny slide where he talked about Oh, you were in that presentation where he talked about how for a lot of early successional shrubs, they spend 5 years of riotous sex, and then they're kind of shaded out for another 100 years.
Yeah. Well, the Yellowstone fires were instructive for that. Maybe you and a lot of your listeners remember spreads of pictures in National Geographic or other magazines with these enormous wildflower meadows, just chock-a-block full of fireweed and all sorts of other things in flower, with maybe an elk walking through it up to its withers in bloom in what had formerly been dense lodgepole pine forest. So it eventually does come around. It would be interesting to know too, and it's probably in the literature and I don't know it. You had mentioned openings and meadows within fires. And it would be interesting to know how the heat, the intensity of the fire, and therefore its severity in terms of the biota, what it was like inside of those versus underneath the canopy of the fire. Maybe those end up being islands from which bees forage out. Maybe that's where they were nesting the whole time, like you mentioned. And so it really doesn't change things for those bees as much as we thought. Don't really know. I don't know at any rate.
Well, it strikes me that these are some of the questions that are coming out of the Rivers Lab, and I anticipate with these fires there'll be continued research out of their lab looking at these issues. But I guess, and I'm sure they've asked you this question, and many people have asked you this question. So if the bees, let's imagine the bees come out in the worst case scenario, scenario they survive, but there's really not much in these forests in the first year, and there's a decline. And the flowers come. How far do bees disperse in these systems to be able to reseed? Like how many years might we expect for these bees to kind of find this patch, establish, and start to repopulate and get moving?
Two steps to that dispersal. The first one is the beginning of your scenario, where next year the bees emerge and they are nesting well within the perimeter of the fire, or at least around their nest. There's nothing there. They may choose to disperse, go flying to find a new place to nest. And we don't know for bees how far can they do that and be successful. Because they have to fly in the right direction if it was a huge fire in order not to fly further into the burn. They may be able to sense by odor or the like borne on the wind which direction flowers and vegetation are going to be. So individuals may not stay in residence within the burn, but they may nonetheless live to nest another year. As far as recolonization, I don't think we have a good sense of that and the order of recolonization. Bumblebees, we know from some work that Sujaya was doing there at Oregon State, that even foragers for bumblebees can travel multiple miles for a foraging trip if they deem it worth their while to go that far. It seems to be, at any rate, it was convincing evidence. And there's work from England with some of that as well. And if that's the case, then even a fire, it would have to be a fire in which a huge fire in which it's many miles in any direction within the fire perimeter before you encounter intact vegetation. So a bee like a bumblebee may be able to settle in fastest, and they don't really want in an anthropomorphic sense. It's not worth their while to settle in the first year because there's not going to be much bloom anyway. So the progression we're not sure of. With Byron's and my chronosequence work here in the sagebrush steppe in these huge fires, as it turns out, the bees were there and the flowers were there. So our chronosequence really didn't show the pace of recolonization because they were already colonized, these fires.
Right. So in that case, in that situation, the bees come up. There's plants that have escaped, either they're underground or they've got their growing edges below the fire. they're not damaged.
Yeah, their apical meristem is protected by the soil, like you pointed out. It's implicit.
I was looking for. So the bees pop out, and then so they kind of reestablish. And you don't see any real shift in the bee community, but in situations where either the fire was deeper or you don't have, I guess, the plants that can regenerate the next year, that you may have a different situation. And there, I think I heard you saying that things like bumblebees that have long dispersal patterns may be the first ones. You may have very rich bumblebee communities, and then over time. But I think I also heard you say that we really don't know how the specificity of how we don't have it very well characterized. What bees will come in and at what time, and those kinds of details.
No, not really. Because for Byron and I, it took multiple years to get this chrono sequence of just 20 or 25 huge fires. Because first you have to have access in terms of a road or path or something. You have to be able to get way within the perimeter of the fire to have some confidence that these are resident bees. And then you have to find the floral host. And we weren't comparing apples and oranges. We went with several widespread, prevalent, perennial wildflowers that are herbaceous. But you have to be able to find them. We did a lot of, you think bird watchers use binoculars a lot. We use binoculars extensively that save us from walking a half mile only to find out that, that's really not the plant we thought it was. We can't use that. And meanwhile, a couple of hours have passed and the period of good weather is coming to an end in a couple of days, and you just squandered some of your efforts. So it took an enormous amount of effort, because little fires, it's not a big deal. Bees just come in from the outside. And most of the fire literature with bees is that sort of evaluation, or there's no attention paid to where's the burn perimeter relative to where I'm sampling. But these big fires that you've had would be really interesting to look. I wouldn't look this coming year. Oh, you could. But for people who are interested to get, if they're allowed to, they may not be allowed to because the forest may be closed because of worry about deadfalls. But they could look in, say, 2 years for, say, resprouting blueberries or huckleberries and see who's visiting them well inside the fire perimeter. That would be interesting. And I wouldn't put much money on a bet either way as to what the result would be, because we don't know.
Fantastic, Jim. Let's take a quick break, and I want to come back and ask you some. I've been asked many questions from the public on bees and fires, and I wasn't really sure how to handle them, so I did my best. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on some of these questions.
Excellent. Sounds good, Anne.
Okay, we're back. So I think I've had a lot of questions from landowners across Oregon who really care about their bees, and obviously it was terrible devastation to all sorts of property, and people's lives have been disrupted. But there are also people who are rebuilding now, and they're thinking about, like, how can I do this in a way that kind of helps these landscapes recover. What are some general considerations? Let's say you're a woodlot owner and you've got some land and it has been burnt down, and you really like to make sure you get a good start for all sorts of wildlife, including bees. What are some considerations to keep in mind?
Yeah, the starting consideration would be for bees, for most bees, would be pollen or nectar resources that they will use. So bees in general, and by species and foraging individuals, certainly have their preferences. And some plants host much greater diversity of bees. They rollick with bees versus ones that are sparsely visited. So for instance, willows in the very early spring, all across the continent and in Europe, willows in general, especially our native brushy willows, are very attractive to a whole suite of bees. They're often used in riparian restoration, and the bees that use them will come along with it. They're also a place where your social species like the sweat bees, get their early spring start if they're out and about with pollen and nectar. Some other shrubs to consider out there, certainly ceanothus, at least the ones that I've seen, can be really busy with bees. And plants in the blueberry family, especially the blueberry genus Vaccinium, but blueberry family, feed a lot of bees, especially bumblebees. One could also look at, I'm not sure what's available for seed, the longer-lived herbaceous wildflowers, that especially legumes or mints that a lot of bees will use, and that's those families. I'm slipping on the name for one of the lotus species, crassifolia maybe, that was prevalent in places and patches down in the Douglas fire complex that certainly could have been seeded much more widely. And then there's things that if you can read about with what comes in after fire, there's one of the classic ones. I don't know if you have, I think I do know that you have some of it, at least in the Western Cascades, are plants like fireweed, whose very name tells you what it does. And it comes in those openings. Iliamna, the mountain maple, or it's not a maple, it's Iliamna is the common name. It's in the mallow family. Comes in after fire. I was collecting bees at it here 4 years after a fire, and even the specialists had shown up for it. Bees that's the only genus they use, and there they were. So there's a range of possibilities. I think it's going to be challenging mostly for availability of seed, and then the seed does have to be cut into the ground a little bit, mostly. Most seeds dumped on the surface aren't going to do much. They don't need to be scuffed in much, a quarter inch, maybe a half inch for a big seed, just like your own garden. But you don't, when you plant lettuce, for instance, you don't just strew the seed on the surface. You get good soil contact.
Well, it does.
A bit of a challenge.
It does remind me, actually, in this conversation, Jed Arnold is a forester up in Astoria. You know Jed, eh? I'm
very impressed by Jed.
Yeah, he's been seeding into burn piles, and I remember the trick for him is a lot of this native seed does need to be planted in the fall because it does has wintering requirements, but it's tricky because the soil has to cool down sufficiently. You've got this, and for many people, I imagine in Oregon it's probably too late to get your seed in place, but if the ground had been cooled, you could have gone in and put some of this seed in. The thing I remember about it was really free of weeds. He had very good, those seeds really took off well because there was no competition. The seed bank had really been sterilized, essentially.
Yeah, there's actually several really good points there that you bring up, relating them from Jed. It's actually the silver lining to a fire that is severe in terms of soil heating, which is you can cook out the seed bank of potential weeds. Otherwise, weeds, invariably, just like in your vegetable garden, the weeds overtake what you want if you can't control them, and controlling them is a chore. But if you selectively choose spots which your landowners will get to see next spring, what places just stay bare. And those might be the places 11 months from now, would be the places to put down some seeds. I think that's a very good point on your part. And Jed has had experience with a fair number of plant species he's tried seeding and which ones succeed. Oregon Spring would be an interesting one, for instance. That yellow comp that flowers in, I gather, mid-spring, maybe late spring.
That's right, yeah. Farewell to Spring as well, and I think he had some Phacelia species. There's a couple of. It'd be good to sort of think through some of but they're very fast-growing annuals. I think he was generally targeting.
Yeah, and that's a good starting point, I would say. And you could also see those, or examples, maybe, in areas that burned a few years ago, and see what's come up in those places. But what you're really doing is you're jump-starting colonization by providing your own seed, whereas otherwise it's a willy-nilly effect, and then if the seed is lucky enough to land inside the fire and not have competition and have good soil, why then it'll multiply and eventually reseed. But you're jump-starting that. And you might think of it in terms of just starting islands, just spots that look particularly promising, and seed those or plant into those, with vaccinium or the like, blueberries or huckleberries or willows along stream. Just get them started. And if they like the spot, they'll start providing their own seeds thereafter, and they'll spread before the canopy grows back and eventually closes in.
I think that's a great suggestion, and that kind of combined approach of getting trying to get some annuals into that plant community, but also focusing on. I really agree with willow. Such an easy plant to propagate too. It's just not a. I was thinking we were talking earlier about something like the native California lilacs that we have out here. Sometimes getting availability can be a little tricky, but something like willows is so easy to propagate and get in the ground and provide
it. Yeah, I agree.
Okay, Jim. Well, this is great. Thank you so much for taking time to share your knowledge on. And I have to say, I think at this point you're the only person to be on this show 3 times. We really love having you as a guest on pollination. I did a poll recently where I asked people, I asked them sort of what shows do you like, and there's a lot of Jim Kane fans out there.
Well, that's kind. It means you have attentive listeners because I can drone on.
Well, and we do have you booked. We also have our next episode with you kind of already penciled in, at least in our rough calendar, that we're going to have you come back and talk about raspberry pollination. Yeah, and rubus. You don't want to put Himalayan blackberry in where these fires were, but native blackberries and raspberries are fine bee plants, as we'll learn about when we talk about cultivated raspberries in that later show. Well, I guess we brought up blueberries as well, and I guess, 2 thoughts come to mind. The one is this connection between bees and other wildlife. But a lot of these plants, run her out real quick, and they can cover some space fairly aggressively. And I think with some of the rubus species, those big leaves, it just seems whenever I'm hiking, I see big banks of it sometimes where it's really covered and covered that space really quickly. Yeah, that can be, and they're doing it on their own, and it makes a nice concentrated resource for a bee for pollen and nectar. And in addition, going all the way back to the small carpenter bees, the dead pithy stems will provide nesting opportunities for those cavity nesters who have been pushed out by the fire. That is such a great point. Hardhack is another one of those plants. What's hardhack? Okay. I can't remember anymore. Douglasii. What is it? I'll have to look it up when we hang up. Anyways, but there's a lot of these plants that do have pithy stems that are also good pollinator plants. Those are also really great choices. Anyways, thank you so much. Sorry that was an extended goodbye, but thank you so much, Jim, and have a warm winter out there in Utah. Yes, with moisture. We need moisture, Anthony. Good to talk with you again. Always good. Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn Sin and Neal, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. The first one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.